So hello everyone. I appreciate all the punctual people on the webinar. I want to give others just 60 more seconds before we begin here, and I'll jump right in. So thank you for your patience. Just one more minute. All right. So let's go ahead and begin here. Again, I appreciate everyone joining. I know we may have some latecomers, but that's perfectly fine. I do thank you for your time today. So I'm pretty passionate about today's subject here, and I'll just leave the slide up just as an introduction to myself in case I haven't had the pleasure of speaking to any of you. But I do want to really focus in on this area of conversation, and this is really something that can improve your ability to sign up more cases without really spending any additional dollars on your process. So before I forget, I do want to make everyone aware that there is a questions panel to the right on the meeting side. So I'll be responding to as many of those as possible at the end of today's session. So please feel free to type your questions throughout, and I'll get to those at the end. Also, there's a handout section. I have some information just if you're interested in learning more about Captorra, some of our clients, really what our system does. That's not today's focus. Today is about lead follow-up and the process in general. So I did want to add some information there on the right if you're interested in learning more about Captorra. Now, I'm going to be throwing a lot of statistics at you today, and you might get tired of looking at some graphs and numbers, but as it relates to lead follow-up, I do think these numbers are important because most people I talk to in the industry just really don't have a good idea on what these results are within their own firm. So I do want to review those with you guys. And before we jump right into these 5 mistakes that firms make during lead follow-up, I just want to quickly set the stage for why we here at Captorra have the ability and the credibility to talk about this subject. I know a lot of you are probably familiar with Captorra by name, but as you can see here, we specifically work with plaintiff firms around the country, and our clients go from smaller firms with just 1 or 2 people handling the lead follow-up process all the way to some of the largest national firms around the country. And we've implemented Captorra in over 100 firms and have designed the application to specifically help firms with the lead follow-up process and, more importantly, get to that point of signing up the client. So we've really seen it all at this point, and as it relates to not only just intake in general, but just how firms are handling the follow-up process. I think it's also important, item number 5 there, it's important to mention the partnership that we have with Gary Falkowitz when we created Intake Conversion Experts, also called ICE. And ICE is a call service specifically designed for plaintiff firms to help outsource the intake and follow-up process, where we take the firm's criteria for a given type of case and then take the lead all the way through qualification, even sign up. And I mention this for today's purpose mainly to state that we not only see how firms handle this process from a software perspective, but we actually live this day to day, and our own ICE company strives, or doesn't strive for that matter, on how good we are at lead follow-up. So I just wanted to mention that just from a kind of a content perspective for why I'm talking about this today. All right, so today's focus will be on these 5 common mistakes that we see here. And this is what, just out of 5 years of being in this business and focusing on intake, the 5 most common and honestly not overly difficult areas that firms make mistakes on that we can talk about improving. And these are of course just 5 areas, and we can talk about some others, but I want to focus on these. And with the end result being to improve that follow-up process, that connection rate that you have with your web leads, specifically your electronic leads, and of course connect with more claimants and sign up more clients. We're going to look at how quickly or slowly, for that matter, firms are initially reaching out to potential clients. And then I want to also discuss the fear that firms and staff specifically typically have about upsetting a client with too many calls, and we'll look at some statistics about that. And we also want to review the different methods of communicating and how effective each one is and how best to implement those forms of communication outside of just a standard phone call, which is what most firms do. And a common mistake that we see a lot of groups make is following up at the same time of day. So I'll talk about how to avoid that pitfall, and then finally discuss how important tracking is for these metrics for your firm and how best to implement that process as a whole. So let's jump right in here. And I want to start right out of the gate with what is probably the biggest issue firms have, and it really isn't all that difficult to fix, and that's following up on a lead immediately. And when I say immediately, I mean immediately. So this study on the left is from an MIT study used, and they used a barometer of 60 seconds to initially reach out to a potential client. And while that time frame a lot of times is difficult to accomplish, what I would tell you is 5 minutes should really be your gold standard for your first initial reach out to a contact who has or a potential client who has contacted you electronically. Now, reaching out to a lead within the first 5 minutes you receive their information should really take priority over pretty much anything else your firm is doing at that time. I mean, anything. So you can see on the chart on the right just how quickly your chance of connecting with the lead drops after that initial 5-minute mark. Another fact that is true that I don't necessarily need a chart to state is that you as a firm cannot litigate or settle a case you don't have. So if your connection rate drops by that much, I would really make that your primary objective, to get a hold of that potential client right away when you receive that information. So make sure that following up immediately with, whether it's a web lead, a chat lead, a call that your after hours answering service took, or even leads that you're purchasing from third-party lead generators certainly takes precedence. Now the number 238, most of you probably read that by now, but 238%, the increase of your chance of signing a qualified client over your competitor, that number is difficult to fathom, and that could mean a lot of different things for different firms depending on your volume. But I'm sure anybody in this call would take that in a heartbeat, even if it just means 1 or 2 cases a month. So extremely important. And I also just want to state, while we're talking about this subject, that assumptions are dangerous. And the reason I say that is because whether people like to admit it or not, I see way too many firms make the assumption that just because a claimant reached out to your firm via your website, specifically that they want to sign with you, that because they contacted your firm and they came to your website, they want to sign with you. And really a more accurate and safe assumption is that the claimant has also reached out to 2 other firms along with yours. And again, this is especially true for website contact forms and chat services and those leads that come through those forms of communication, because consumers who go down the path of researching law firms online are the majority of the time submitting their information on multiple sites. So this is where that increase in the sign-up percentage on first contact really comes into play. And then the next item I want to get into is something that comes up a lot when I'm actually presenting Captorra to a firm and kind of showing our automated follow-up tool. A question I get a lot, or a concern I get, is, how do we not, piss off the potential client by contacting them too much? And my response always is, don't worry about that, and let them tell you that they're not interested in your services. So the chart on the right here is from a 2011 study conducted with 500 consumers across the country for different varying services, not just legal, but across different services. But I truly believe that the results still ring true just among the legal community as well. And what immediately jumped out to me is that 2 of the top 3 complaints consumers have about submitting a web inquiry is that they never got contacted or that the response took too long. In fact, you'll notice the second one still has nothing to do with too many attempts to contact them. It's simply related to customer service, which isn't really today's topic, but of course, make sure your staff is being extremely sympathetic and understanding during their follow-up process. And if you take whether or not a claimant actually has a real case or not out of the equation, pretty much every person who is pursuing a case truly wants to retain a law firm services. So we probably all can agree on that. So with that in mind, the alternative to following up too much is that they just end up signing with another firm anyways. So I would always have that assumption in the mind and kind of ingrained in your mentality when you or your staff are inside of this follow-up process. And even if the potential client doesn't have a case and your competition is still able to get in touch with them first, it means they're able to kind of plant that seed of marketing for future needs should that person ever have a case or have a family or friend who has a case. So there's still a lot of advantages for jumping on a lead right away and then continuing the multiple follow-up process. Even if it's a chat lead that comes in, you can tell by what they typed, you're 99% sure it's not a case. Still pursue that lead. Make sure you're very sympathetic and able to communicate that your firm is able to help them in the future, even if you can't help them today. All right, so now that we've talked about how much you shouldn't really be concerned about following up too often, I want to jump into what that multiple follow-up process should look like. And the numbers on the right are from a report across 5,000 leads back in 2016. And the absolute minimum number of attempts you should be making is 6. And we actually, in the Captorra system, we have 7 attempts as our out-of-the-box number before we mark the lead as kind of quote-unquote dead. But based on the results you see here, you should certainly be making at least 6 attempts before giving up on the claimant, since your success rate doesn't really start to plateau until after that 6th attempt. And the numerous follow-up attempts needed to reach potential clients does bring me something I want to talk about just real quickly that I don't really have a specific slide for. But if possible, your firm should really consider dedicating staff members or even a department for following up with leads. In my experience, and I don't want to make anybody mad here, but just a fact, attorneys and legal staff are just not great at following up with potential clients. And I really completely understand why. Your day as a legal staff member within a firm is prioritized by your current caseload a lot of times. And whether you like to admit it or not, your ability to quickly call a lead or to make that 6th or 7th attempt is going to be hindered by other priorities in your day as a legal staff member. And not only that, just in my experience being in the sales world for pretty much my entire life, it just takes a completely different mentality to kind of smile and dial, to use an old sales term. And most people within a firm can certainly successfully take a direct phone call from a potential client and go through an intake, but that same person isn't necessarily equipped to successfully jump on a lead right away or call them for the 4th or 5th time, which, as we see here, a lot of times is needed to convert them into a successful contact or even a signed-up client. And I just wanted to mention that before we move on, because I do believe that too many firms try to have their legal staff kind of wear too many hats with this process, which hinders their entire follow-up capabilities. And these are firms that certainly have the resources and the ability and the volume to substantiate dedicated staff. So I would certainly be mindful of that as well when looking at making some changes with your lead follow-up process. So this slide shows an example of an automated email and a text message from my presentation environment for Capsule. And whether you're using our system or not, I just wanted to say it's really important to make sure you're not simply relying on phone calls and voicemails to connect with the leads. So people today it's a fact, they just simply do not answer the phone if the number calling is not saved already. Unless you're in a business setting like a lot of us, that may not be true, but just in general, people like to ignore those calls. And they're going to wait for the voicemail or the email or some other communication to see how they want to proceed with calling you back. So along with utilizing these different methods, it's also important to provide valuable content to the claimant with each touch point. So whether you're calling and leaving a voicemail or sending an email or text message, it's important to make sure that each time you reach out, you're providing something different of value to that potential client. Whether that's on your first attempt, stressing how time is of the essence, and then on your second attempt, stating your firm's successful track record with their type of auto case or it's a mass tort case, stating what you've recently been able to do. It is extremely important to make sure your messaging isn't stale as you're following up multiple times, and there's something there to prompt them to want to contact you back versus a competitor who might also be following up with them as well. And to take this subject a step further, I want to specifically focus on the importance of leveraging text messaging as part of your follow-up process. And here are some numbers from a study from last year that show just how much more effective text messaging is over email. Most firms I talk to today have gone down the path of utilizing some type of email communication as follow-up, not just relying on phone calls, but implementing email, even if it's manual. But most groups still, believe it or not, if you're text messaging, you're good for you and kudos to you, because most groups are not, at least not to the level of where they could be. And I certainly, they haven't jumped on the text messaging bandwagon, and that could be certainly detrimental based on these numbers. The fact that 98% of text messages are open versus 22% of emails shows just how much more effective text messaging is. I know for me, that number is 100%. I can't think of a text message I've never opened. And it's probably just because I'm a little OCD and I don't like the red number being there on my messages stating that I have an unopened text message. But I think that's probably true for most people. I mean, they're gonna open a text message right away versus potentially an email. And emails can of course be filtered by junk folders as well, so you need to be mindful of that. And the last fact here regarding time to open is extremely important as well. 3 minutes for text messages versus an average of 384 minutes for emails can easily make the difference of you connecting with your next client versus another firm connecting with that qualified claimant as well. And even if a potential client does end up opening the email, it most likely is going to take them much longer to respond than if it was a text message. And again, just speaking from personal experience, it's just kind of ingrained in my mentality based on the technology I use today that when I get a text message, I need to respond to that pretty much immediately versus an email that I know I can relate to a little bit later if I need to and respond to before the end of the day. Now, I noticed when I was first starting the webinar, there's some Captorra clients on the call today, and I greatly appreciate you guys joining. But I didn't want my last statement mean to start texting me nonstop versus email. I promise we certainly reply to emails as a service company as quickly as possible, but that's not always the case with your potential clients. So it's very important to leverage text messaging as much as possible. And the excuse I sometimes hear from attorneys at law firms that my client base doesn't have smartphones or won't respond to text messaging. Just to be blunt, I think is very lazy and dangerous. I mean, let's just say for argument's sake that 10% of your potential client base has the ability to receive text messages, which I know beyond a shadow of a doubt is extremely low and an accurate number, but for argument's sake, let's say it's 10%. Even if you're able to connect with just that 10% with a text message, it can make a huge difference with your conversion of not only just connecting with a claimant quickly and exhausting efforts of more and more phone calls, but also signing them up if they're qualified as well. So please be mindful of that and implement text messaging at any point that you can. So moving on to the next point, I want to talk about following up at different times of the day. And these numbers you see here are probably not all that surprising to a lot of you, but I do see specific staff making the mistake of following up at the same time with a potential client over and over again. And I believe it's really their way of easily remembering that they need to follow up again with the claimant, which is a great mentality to have, but doing so at that same time every day could be a big waste of time. If a potential client can't answer the phone or get back to you at 10:30 a.m. because they're sitting at work on a Monday, that's probably the case on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday as well. So making that call at the same time is really not all that beneficial. So really try to track when you're making these attempts and stagger them at different times for each one. On top of this, I would really recommend making your follow-up attempts after the initial time you reach out. So again, reach out immediately, but the ones after that, try to focus some of those attempts before 9 a.m. and then after 4 or even 5 p.m. And that tends to be the time that the average person or consumer can take time to discuss their case. So if at all possible, I would also say try to even have someone at your firm making some follow-up attempts on the weekend, even if it's you as the attorney. I mentioned our call service, ICE, earlier, and we find that some of our highest success rates of getting a hold of especially stale leads that firms send us that are weeks and months old, that connection rate tends to be a lot higher during these time frames, early in the morning, later in the evening, and then even on the weekend as well. So we, aside from the facts that we have here, we see that within our own call center as well. And then really the last main point I want to make here is the need to track this data that we've been talking about. It's really impossible for you to know what is and isn't working and make changes based on that if you don't actually have the analytics to look at and to implement those changes. Captorra, I have to say, I can't avoid it, but I mean, Captorra can do a lot of this for you, but with our system or not, it's certainly critical that you know when leads are coming into your firm, and then on average, how quickly your staff is making that first initial call, and then how many attempts your staff is making after that. The report I pulled from my demonstration environment, as you can see, it's showing me that data. It's showing me here's the intake, here's the time that it hit the system, and then here's how many total number of attempts have been made, when they were made, and by whom. So I can quickly look at that data and know whether or not my staff is or is not able to jump on that lead right away. And if we're falling behind on some of these attempts and they need to be reallocated to other staff, or if we just need to make changes within our lead follow-up process. And again, I think, a lot of these things we talked about today are things that you can look at and just be, more accountable and have the discipline within your firm to really discuss and make those changes without really spending additional dollars on your marketing or even additional resources. It's just changes that can be made internally. So before I open it up for questions, I know it's kind of a quick webinar today, but that was on purpose. I know you guys are busy, but I did want to leave this up and talk about this chart for a second, because I think it's pretty eye-opening. So these are real results based on some tests that we did with 50 law firms about a year ago. So we put on an intake seminar with Gary Fockowitz, I mentioned earlier, who's an intake consultant and our business partner at ICE. And prior to the seminar, we submitted 50 web inquiries to the firms that were attending, and these are the real results that we got. These are real numbers. So the reason I wanted to share this at the end is because I've talked about the subject to different firms at different times a lot, and the common comment, especially from the partners I'll receive, is, oh, we always contact the lead right away, or we would never wait more than an hour to follow up on a lead. And I genuinely think that they believe that when they say it, but the facts just don't ring true to that across the board. I think some firms, as you can see, within 5 minutes, 7%. So a sample size of 57% is who did it within 5 minutes. So those firms are accurate in that statement, but a lot more than 7% of firms are saying that they're calling within 5 minutes, or they're making 7 attempts. And I should say that the majority of these firms are actually pretty well-known plaintiff firms with dedicated intake staff. So even having dedicated staff doesn't just fix this issue. You need to be mindful of what's taking place in your firm and make sure that these are being implemented properly. So I promise I didn't bring this up to piss everyone off or to call people liars. I think it's important to really with anything we do in life, but for today's subject to take your head out of the sand, and I have to remind myself to do the same thing about internal things that we deal with as well, but to really focus in on what's taking place in your firm. And really track this data and implement these, some of the items we talked about today. So as I mentioned, it was quick. I wanted to be pretty quick. I know you guys probably have some questions here, so I want to open it up. I see a couple of questions that were already typed in. So let me open those up here. Let's see here. Sorry, I'm trying to expand this window for you guys. If you guys haven't already asked a question, feel free to type as I'm opening this up. Somebody asked about a recording of the presentation. Yes, so I have been recording this presentation through GoToWebinar. I'll load it to our website in the next couple of days. I believe if you're registered, GoToWebinar will also send you a link to the recording as well, but it'll also be up on our website in the next 48 hours as well. So thank you for asking that. This is a good one. So is this the 6 times follow-up, the minimum of 6 times? Eric asked, is that 6 times a day? No, my apologies for not mentioning that. And Eric, I appreciate you asking that question so I can expand upon that. I could have gotten a lot more specific, but what I will tell you is I think that 2 attempts in the first day is critical. Once you make the first attempt, do it within the next 4 hours. I would make the second attempt. It's important to try that claimant twice in the first day. Those 7 attempts we talked about, we traditionally, for single event cases, will go out over the course of 30 days, with those first 2 or 3 attempts being pretty close together, and then they spread out a little bit more. But yeah, thank you for asking that, Eric. I don't by any means mean to say 6 attempts in the first day. So I just think you should at least make 6 attempts before exhausting your follow-up process on that lead. We have a question here. Should digital leads be segregated to a specific group? If so, can Captorra help do that? So the first point is 100% yes. If you have the resources and the capability to auto-assign or assign your digital leads to a different group versus staff that may be taking incoming calls, I would highly recommend that. As I mentioned earlier, and I think it's true throughout any sales environment, and that's what this is sales. It takes a different mentality and a different type of person to successfully pick up the phone and make an outbound call. And it's not even in our environment, it's not even a cold call. So it's not overly difficult, but just for a lot of people, that idea of doing that is just something that they just don't enjoy or just are unwilling to do. So I do think it's important to, if you're able to segregate that. If not, I would make sure you're finding staff within your firm who are good at it and who are willing to do it, as opposed to just trying to round robin that necessarily. I think it's more important to make sure you have the correct staff that are handling it. So I would absolutely do that. And then can Captorra help do that? The short answer is absolutely yes. We have automation and workflow to auto assign leads based on certain criteria or where it came from or what type of lead it is. So thank you for that question. Another question here is, are there programs to text with potential clients so staff doesn't have to use their personal cell phone? Great question, and absolutely yes. So within Capsule, we have a text messaging engine that you can use that's handled just within the interface. But even without Capsule, there are what you would call kind of workstation text messaging solutions where it's kind of like your chat windows that you might have on a website. There's software applications out there you can find where you can simply text from a number that exists that you own, but it's not actually a hard phone that people have to carry around. It's a software application that you're logging into to be able to text from. So again, even without Capsule, I would highly recommend finding a solution to be able to utilize that. We just have it already implemented in the ability to automate some of those texts, but certainly find a solution to allow you to text that your staff can handle internally as opposed to requiring them to carry around a cell phone. I have what is the percentage conversion rate if within 5 minutes versus later time frame? So one of the charts I had up earlier talked about, they kind of did it in reverse order. It stated, I may not have left the slide up long enough, I apologize, but it stated there's a 400% drop, 400% drop the ability to connect with a claimant after the first 5 minutes. We ran some tests. I mentioned the web inquiries that we ran. We also did some of the same tests with those web leads on the Captorra side with Captorra clients, and the percentage that we got is 72%. So what I mean when I say that is our Captorra clients were able to contact and connect with a claimant that contacted them through their website 72% more when they called them within the first 5 minutes than after 5 minutes. So I really, it's a great question, Jay, and I really can't stress that first point. That's why I started there. That first point enough, how important, if there's anything else you got out of today, make sure that whatever process you put in place that your staff or you are contacting those claimants in the first 5 minutes. Because if not, you're going to exhaust a lot of effort trying to call them the second, third, or fourth time. And most likely another firm who's actually doing this, because there are many of them out there, have contacted them already if they're within that 5 minute mark. I have a question here. Can you follow up via SMS by using Outlook? I do believe you can. I know you can do the opposite. You can kind of convert a text message into an email. I'm almost positive you can convert an email into a text. I'm certainly not an expert on that, but I know I personally have gotten some text messages that kind of look like Outlook email. So certainly, as the earlier question came in, where there's solutions out there for texting, if you have Outlook as your email, I would certainly look into that as being that you already have that tool. But I just don't know the process and route of doing that since I haven't personally utilized that feature. But I do believe it's a capability of Outlook to convert that into a text message. So here's a good one. Let's say everyone is on the phone. What are some alternative contact methods to keep the process going within 5 minutes? So that's a real life issue that firms have. My recommendation to you is that if you're not already using an overflow or after hours call service, I would highly recommend doing so. If you feel like, and when I say that, I don't just mean for your incoming calls, I mean for your outbound calls as well, your follow-ups. I know we do it at ICE is the reason I say it. It works really well. If you feel like your firm is very good at answering the phone, but you don't have dedicated staff or enough staff to handle the influx of electronic leads, consider outsourcing it. Or I think it is well worth your resources to hire a specific person to make sure that that is very, very rarely happening, that you're outside of that 5 minute mark. Again, the dedicated staff comment, I would say as well, if you have, if right now your process is everyone in my firm answers the phone when it rings, that's fine and great. What you may want to consider is that one person doesn't, and that may roll over to an after hours call service, and that one person's job is to make sure they're making outbound follow-up attempts on your web inquiries, your chat leads, and other electronic leads are coming to you. Because if someone's calling into your firm and they're at least getting hold of your overflow call service who's answering the call as you, they're still talking to your firm, at least in their perception. Your firm answered the phone, so you haven't lost that lead. You have lost the lead that came in that you called 20 minutes later instead of 5 because everybody was on the phone. So I would consider dedicating a resource to that, as we were talking about earlier. And I think I was able to field all the questions there. So I'm right at the 30-minute mark. That wasn't on purpose, but I'm glad we're able to cover all that in 30 minutes. And I know, guys, it was a lot to review, and there may be some additional questions. So our information is right here on the screen. Even if you have no question about Capsule at all, please feel free to reach out to me. I should have put my email address up here as well. It's just dnewberry@captorra.com. And again, this recording will be available in the next 24 to 48 hours. And I sincerely appreciate everyone's time and hope this was valuable to you. So thanks again. Everyone have a good day.